This is Civilization and its Discontents by Freud. He published it in 1930, and it asks why people are not happy. What follows is a pocket edition. The full reading runs almost 4 hours, and this one runs under 2 hours. No sentence here was rewritten. Whole passages were taken out, and what is left is the wording of the translation itself. His argument comes through whole. What had to go is mostly the detours, including a long comparison between the mind and the city of Rome. If you want the whole thing, the complete unabridged reading sits on this channel. Listen to this if you have wondered why more comfort has not made anyone calmer. That is his question. One quick thing before he starts. If this kind of edition is useful to you, subscribe to the channel.
The Oceanic Feeling. The impression forces itself upon one that men measure by false standards, that everyone seeks power, success, riches for himself, and admires others who attain them, while undervaluing the truly precious things in life. And yet, in making any general judgment of this kind, one is in danger of forgetting the manifold variety of humanity and its mental life. There are certain men from whom their contemporaries do not withhold veneration, although their greatness rests on attributes and achievements which are completely foreign to the aims and ideals of the multitude. One might well be inclined to suppose that after all it is only a minority who appreciate these great men, while the majority cares nothing for them. But the discrepancy between men's opinions and their behavior is so wide, and their desires so many, sided that things are probably not so simple. One of these exceptional men calls himself my friend in his letters to me. I had sent him my little book, which treats of religion as an illusion, and he answered that he agreed entirely with my views on religion, but that he was sorry I had not properly appreciated the ultimate source of religious sentiments. This consists in a peculiar feeling which never leaves him personally, which he finds shared by many others, and which he may suppose millions more also experience. It is a feeling which he would like to call a sensation of eternity, a feeling as of something limitless, unbounded, something oceanic. It is, he says, a purely subjective experience, not an article of belief. It implies no assurance of personal immortality. But it is the source of the religious spirit and is taken hold of by the various churches and religious systems, directed by them into definite channels, and also, no doubt, used up in them. One may rightly call oneself religious on the ground of this oceanic feeling alone, even though one reject all beliefs and all illusions. These views, expressed by my friend, whom I so greatly honor, and who himself once in poetry described the magic of illusion, put me in a difficult position. I cannot discover this oceanic feeling in myself. It is not easy to deal scientifically with feelings. One may attempt to describe their physiological signs. Where that is impossible, I am afraid the oceanic feeling, too, will defy this kind of classification. Nothing remains but to turn to the ideational content which most readily associates itself with the feeling. If I have understood my friend aright, he means the same thing, as that consolation offered by an original and somewhat unconventional writer to his hero. Contemplating suicide, out of this world we cannot fall. So it is a feeling of indissoluble connection, of belonging inseparably to the external world as a whole. To me, personally, I may remark, this seems something more in the nature of an intellectual judgment, not, it is true, without any accompanying feeling, tone, but with one of a kind which characterizes other equally far-reaching reflections as well. I could not in my own person convince myself of the primary nature of such a feeling. But I cannot, on that account, deny that it in fact occurs in other people. One can only wonder whether it has been correctly interpreted and whether it is entitled to be acknowledged as the fons et origo of the whole need for religion. Why a feeling is not the source of religion? Thus, we are entirely willing to acknowledge that the oceanic feeling exists in many people, and we are disposed to relate it to an early stage in ego feeling. The further question then arises, what claim this feeling has to be regarded as the source of the need for religion? To me, this claim does not seem very forcible. Surely a feeling can only be a source of energy when it is itself the expression of a strong need. The derivation of a need for religion from the child's feeling of helplessness and the longing it evokes for a father seems to me incontrovertible, especially since this feeling is not simply carried on from childhood days, but is kept alive perpetually by the fear of what the superior power of fate will bring. I could not point to any need in childhood so strong as that for a father's protection. Thus, the part played by the oceanic feeling, which I suppose seeks to reinstate limitless narcissism, cannot possibly take the first place. The derivation of the religious attitude can be followed back in clear outline as far as the child's feeling of helplessness. There may be something else behind this, but for the present it is wrapped in obscurity. I can imagine that the oceanic feeling could become connected with religion later on. That feeling of oneness with the universe, which is its ideational content, sounds very like a first attempt at the consolations of religion, like another way taken by the ego of denying the dangers it sees threatening it in the external world. I must again confess that I find it very difficult to work with these intangible quantities. Another friend of mine, whose insatiable scientific curiosity has impelled him to the most out of the way researches and to the acquisition of encyclopedic knowledge, has assured me that the yogi, by their practices of withdrawal from the world, concentrating attention on bodily functions, peculiar methods of breathing, actually are able to produce new sensations and diffused feelings in themselves, which he regards as regressions to primordial, deeply buried mental states. He sees in them a physiological foundation, so to speak, of much of the wisdom of mysticism. There would be connections to be made here with many obscure modifications of mental life, such as trance and ecstasy. But I am moved to exclaim, in the words of Schiller's diver, "What men want from life?" The question, "What is the purpose of human life?" has been asked times without number. It has never received a satisfactory answer. Perhaps it does not admit of such an answer. Many a questioner has added that if it should appear that life has no purpose, then it would lose all value for him. But these threats alter nothing. It looks, on the contrary, as though one had a right to dismiss this question, for it seems to presuppose that belief in the superiority of the human race, with which we are already so familiar, in its other expressions. Nobody asks, what is the purpose of the lives of animals, unless, peradventure, they are designed to be of service to man. But this, too, will not hold, for with many animals man can do nothing except describe, classify, and study them. And countless species have declined to be put even to this use, by living and dying and becoming extinct before men had set eyes upon them. So again, only religion is able to answer the question of the purpose of life. One can hardly go wrong in concluding that the idea of a purpose in life stands and falls with the religious system. We will turn, therefore, to the less ambitious problem: what the behavior of men themselves reveals as the purpose and object of their lives, what they demand of life and wish to attain in it. The answer to this can hardly be in doubt. They seek happiness, they want to become happy and to remain so. There are two sides to this striving, a positive and a negative. It aims on the one hand at eliminating pain and discomfort, on the other at the experience of intense pleasures. In its narrower sense, the word happiness relates only to the last. Thus, human activities branch off in two directions, corresponding to this double goal, according to which of the two they aim at realizing, either predominantly or even exclusively. As we see, it is simply the pleasure principle which draws up the program of life's purpose. This principle dominates the operation of the mental apparatus from the very beginning. There can be no doubt about its efficiency. And yet its program is in conflict with the whole world, with the macrocosm as much as with the microcosm. It simply cannot be put into execution. The whole constitution of things runs counter to it. One might say the intention that man should be happy is not included in the scheme of creation. What is called happiness in its narrowest sense comes from the satisfaction, most often instantaneous, of pent-up needs which have reached great intensity, and by its very nature can only be a transitory experience. When any condition desired by the pleasure principle is protracted, it results in a feeling only of mild comfort. We are so constituted that we can only intensely enjoy contrasts, much less intensely states in themselves. Our possibilities of happiness are thus limited from the start by our very constitution. It is much less difficult to be unhappy. Suffering comes from three quarters: from our own body, which is destined to decay and dissolution, and cannot even dispense with anxiety and pain as danger signals from the outer world, which can rage against us with the most powerful and pitiless forces of destruction, and finally from our relations with other men. The unhappiness, which has this last origin, we find, perhaps more painful than any other. We tend to regard it more or less as a gratuitous addition, although it cannot be any less an inevitable fate than the suffering that proceeds from other sources. It is no wonder if, under the pressure of these possibilities of suffering, humanity is wont to reduce its demands for happiness, just as even the pleasure principle itself changes into the more accommodating reality principle under the influence of external environment. If a man thinks himself happy, if he has merely escaped unhappiness or weathered trouble, if in general the task of avoiding pain forces that of obtaining pleasure into the background, reflection shows that there are very different ways of attempting to perform this task. And all these ways have been recommended by the various schools of wisdom in the art of life and put into practice by men. Unbridled gratification of all desires forces itself into the foreground as the most alluring guiding principle in life. But it entails preferring enjoyment to caution and penalizes itself after short indulgence. The other methods, in which avoidance of pain is the main motive, are differentiated according to the source of the suffering against which they are mainly directed. Some of these measures are extreme and some moderate, some are one-sided, and some deal with several aspects of the matter at once. Voluntary loneliness, isolation from others, is the readiest safeguard against the unhappiness that may arise out of human relations. We know what this means. The happiness found along this path is that of peace. Against the dreaded outer world one can defend oneself only by turning away in some other direction, if the difficulty is to be solved single-handed. There is indeed another and a better way. That of combining with the rest of the human community and taking up the attack on nature, thus forcing it to obey human will under the guidance of science. One is working then with all for the good of all. But the most interesting methods for averting pain are those which aim at influencing the organism itself. In the last analysis, all pain is but sensation. It only exists in so far as we feel it, and we feel it only in consequence of certain characteristics of our organism. The ways we escape suffering. The crudest of these methods of influencing the body, but also the most effective, is the chemical one, that of intoxication. I do not think anyone entirely understands their operation, but it is a fact that there are certain substances foreign to the body, which, when present in the blood or tissues, directly cause us pleasurable sensations, but also so change the conditions of our perceptivity that we become insensible of disagreeable sensations. The two effects not only take place simultaneously, they seem to be closely bound up with each other. But there must be substances in the chemical composition of our bodies which can do the same, for we know of at least one morbid state, that of mania, in which a condition similar to this intoxication arises without any drug being absorbed. Besides this, our normal mental life shows variations, according to which pleasure is experienced with more or less ease. And along with this goes a diminished or increased sensitivity to pain. It is greatly to be regretted that this toxic aspect of mental processes has so far eluded scientific research. The services rendered by intoxicating substances in the struggle for happiness and in warding off misery rank so highly as a benefit that both individuals and races have given them an established position within their libido economy. It is not merely the immediate gain in pleasure which one owes to them, but also a measure of that independence of the outer world, which is so sorely craved. Men know that with the help they can get from drowning their cares, they can at any time slip away from the oppression of reality and find a refuge in a world of their own where painful feelings do not enter. We are aware that it is just this property which constitutes the danger and injuriousness of intoxicating substances. In certain circumstances, they are to blame when valuable energies, which could have been used to improve the lot of humanity, are uselessly wasted. Another method of guarding against pain is by using the libido, displacements that our mental equipment allows of, by which it gains so greatly in flexibility. The task is then one of transferring the instinctual aims into such directions that they cannot be frustrated by the outer world. Sublimation of the instincts lends an aid in this. Its success is greatest when a man knows how to heighten sufficiently his capacity for obtaining pleasure from mental and intellectual work. Fate has little power against him then. This kind of satisfaction, such as the artist's joy in creation, in embodying his fantasies, or the scientist's in solving problems or discovering truth, has a special quality which we shall certainly one day be able to define metapsychologically. Until then, we can only say metaphorically, it seems to us higher and finer. But compared with that of gratifying gross primitive instincts, its intensity is tempered and diffused. It does not overwhelm us physically. The weak point of this method, however, is that it is not generally applicable. It is only available to the few. It presupposes special gifts and dispositions which are not very commonly found in a sufficient degree. And even to these few, it does not secure complete protection against suffering. It gives no invulnerable armor against the arrows of fate. And it usually fails when a man's own body becomes a source of suffering to him. Another method operates more energetically and thoroughly. It regards reality as the source of all suffering, as the one and only enemy, with whom life is intolerable, and with whom therefore all relations must be broken off, if one is to be happy in any way at all. the hermit turns his back on this world, he will have nothing to do with it. But one can do more than that. One can try to recreate it, try to build up another instead, from which the most unbearable features are eliminated and replaced by others corresponding to one's own wishes. He who in his despair and defiance sets out on this path will not as a rule get very far. Reality will be too strong for him. He becomes a madman and usually finds no one to help him in carrying through his delusion. It is said, however, that each one of us behaves in some respect like the paranoiac, substituting a wish, fulfillment for some aspect of the world, which is unbearable to him, and carrying this delusion through into reality. When a large number of people make this attempt together and try to obtain assurance of happiness and protection from suffering by a delusional transformation of reality, it acquires special significance. The religions of humanity, too, must be classified as mass delusions of this kind. Needless to say, no one who shares a delusion recognizes it as such. We may here go on to consider the interesting case in which happiness in life is sought first and foremost in the enjoyment of beauty. Wherever it is to be found by our senses and our judgment, the beauty of human forms and movements, of natural objects, of landscapes, of artistic and even scientific creations. As a goal, in life this aesthetic attitude offers little protection against the menace of suffering, but it is able to compensate for a great deal. The enjoyment of beauty produces a particular, mildly intoxicating kind of sensation. There is no very evident use in beauty. The necessity of it for cultural purposes is not apparent, and yet civilization could not do without it. The science of aesthetics investigates the conditions in which things are regarded as beautiful. It can give no explanation of the nature or origin of beauty, as usual. Its lack of results is concealed under a flood of resounding and meaningless words. Unfortunately, psychoanalysis, too, has less to say about beauty than about most things. Its derivation from the realms of sexual sensation is all that seems certain. The love of beauty is a perfect example of a feeling with an inhibited aim. Beauty and attraction are first of all the attributes of a sexual object. It is remarkable that the genitals themselves, the sight of which is always exciting, are hardly ever regarded as beautiful. The quality of beauty seems, on the other hand, to attach to certain secondary sexual characters. Religion circumscribes these measures of choice and adaptation by urging upon everyone alike its single way of achieving happiness and guarding against pain. Its method consists in decrying the value of life and promulgating a view of the real world that is distorted like a delusion. And both of these imply a preliminary, intimidating influence upon intelligence. At such a cost, by the forcible imposition of mental infantilism and inducing a mass delusion, religion succeeds in saving many people from individual neuroses, but little more. There are, as we have said, many paths by which the happiness attainable for man can be reached, but none which is certain to take him to it. Nor can religion keep her promises either. When the faithful find themselves reduced in the end to speaking of God's inscrutable decree, they thereby avow that all that is left to them in their sufferings is unconditional submission as a last, remaining consolation and source of happiness. And if a man is willing to come to this, he could probably have arrived there by a shorter road. What civilization is? Our discussion of happiness has so far not taught us much that is not already common knowledge. Nor does the prospect of discovering anything new seem much greater if we go on with the problem: why it is so hard for mankind to be happy. We gave the answer before when we cited the three sources of human sufferings, namely, the superior force of nature, the disposition to decay of our bodies, and the inadequacy of our methods of regulating human relations in the family, the community, and the state. In regard to the first two, our judgment cannot hesitate. It forces us to recognize these sources of suffering and to submit to the inevitable. We shall never completely subdue nature. Our body, too, is an organism, itself a part of nature, and will always contain the seeds of dissolution, with its limited powers of adaptation and achievement. The effect of this recognition is in no way disheartening. On the contrary, it points out the direction for our efforts. If we cannot abolish all suffering, yet a great deal of it we can, and can mitigate more. The experience of several thousand years has convinced us of this. To the third, the social source of our distresses, we take up a different attitude. We prefer not to regard it as one at all. We cannot see why the systems we have ourselves created should not rather ensure protection and well-being for us all. To be sure, when we consider how unsuccessful our efforts to safeguard against suffering in this particular have proved, the suspicion dawns upon us that a bit of unconquerable nature lurks, concealed behind this difficulty as well, in the shape of our own mental constitution. When we start to consider this possibility, we come across a point of view which is so amazing that we will pause over it. According to it, our so-called civilization itself is to blame for a great part of our misery, and we should be much happier if we were to give it up and go back to primitive conditions. I call this amazing because, however one may define culture, it is undeniable that every means by which we try to guard ourselves against menaces from the several sources of human distress is a part of this same culture. How has it come about that so many people have adopted this strange attitude of hostility to civilization? In my opinion, it arose from a background of profound long-standing discontent with the existing state of civilization, which finally crystallized into this judgment as a result of certain historical happenings. I believe I can identify the last two of these. I am not learned enough to trace the links in the chain back into the history of the human species. At the time when Christianity conquered the pagan religions, some such antagonism to culture must already have been actively at work. It is closely related to the low estimation put upon earthly life by Christian doctrine. The earlier of the last two historical developments was when, as a result of voyages of discovery, men came into contact with primitive peoples and races. To the Europeans, who failed to observe them carefully and misunderstood what they saw, these people seemed to lead simple, happy lives, wanting for nothing, such as the travelers who visited them, with all their superior culture, were unable to achieve. A later experience has corrected this opinion on many points. In several instances, the ease of life was due to the bounty of nature and the possibilities of ready satisfaction for the great human needs. But it was erroneously attributed to the absence of the complicated conditions of civilization. The last of the two historical events is especially familiar to us. It was when people began to understand the nature of the neuroses, which threatened to undermine the modicum of happiness open to civilized man. It was found that men become neurotic because they cannot tolerate the degree of privation that society imposes on them in virtue of its cultural ideals. And it was supposed that a return to greater possibilities of happiness would ensue if these standards were abolished or greatly relaxed. It seems to be certain that our present-day civilization does not inspire in us a feeling of well-being, but it is very difficult to form an opinion whether in earlier times people felt any happier and what part their cultural conditions played in the question. We always tend to regard trouble objectively, i.e., to place ourselves with our own wants and our own sensibilities in the same conditions, so as to discover what opportunities for happiness or unhappiness we should find in them. This method of considering the problem, which appears to be objective, because it ignores the varieties of subjective sensitivity, is of course the most subjective possible, for by applying it one substitutes one's own mental attitude for the unknown attitude of other men. Happiness, on the contrary, is something essentially subjective. However, we may shrink in horror at the thought of certain situations. That of the galley, slaves in antiquity, of the peasants in the 30 Years' War, of the victims of the Inquisition, of the Jews awaiting a pogrom. It is still impossible for us to feel ourselves into the position of these people, to imagine the differences which would be brought about by constitutional obtuseness of feeling, gradual stupefaction, the cessation of all anticipation, and by all the grosser and more subtle ways in which insensibility to both pleasurable and painful sensations can be induced. Moreover, on occasions, when the most extreme forms of suffering have to be endured, special mental protective devices come into operation. It seems to me unprofitable to follow up this aspect of the problem further. The beginning is easy. We recognize as belonging to culture all the activities and possessions which men use to make the earth serviceable to them, to protect them against the tyranny of natural forces, and so on. There is less doubt about this aspect of civilization than any other. If we go back far enough, we find that the first acts of civilization were the use of tools, the gaining of power over fire, and the construction of dwellings. Among these, the acquisition of power over fire stands out as a quite exceptional achievement without a prototype, while the other two opened up paths which have ever since been pursued by man, the stimulus towards which is easily imagined. By means of all his tools, man makes his own organs more perfect, both the motor and the sensory, or else removes the obstacles in the way of their activity. Machinery places gigantic power at his disposal which, like his muscles, he can employ in any direction. Ships and aircraft have the effect that neither air nor water can prevent his traversing them. With spectacles, he corrects the defects of the lens in his own eyes. With telescopes, he looks at far distances. With the microscope, he overcomes the limitations in visibility due to the structure of his retina. With the photographic camera, he has created an instrument which registers transitory visual impressions, just as the gramophone does with equally transient auditory ones. Both are at bottom materializations of his own power of memory. With the help of the telephone, he can hear at distances which even fairy tales would treat as insuperable. Writing to begin with was the voice of the absent. Dwellings were a substitute for the mother's womb, that first abode in which he was safe and felt so content, for which he probably yearns ever after. The liberty of the individual. According to general opinion, however, there is one feature of culture which characterizes it better than any other, and that is the value it sets upon the higher mental activities, intellectual, scientific, and aesthetic achievement, the leading part it concedes to ideas in human life. First and foremost among these ideas come the religious systems with their complicated evolution, on which I have elsewhere endeavored to throw a light. Next to them come philosophical speculations, and last, the ideals man has formed, his conceptions of the perfection possible in an individual, in a people, in humanity as a whole, and the demands he makes on the basis of these conceptions. These creations of his mind are not independent of each other. On the contrary, they are closely interwoven, and this complicates the attempt to describe them, as well as that to trace their psychological derivation. If we assume as a general hypothesis that the force behind all human activities is a striving towards the two convergent aims of profit and pleasure, we must then acknowledge this as valid also for these other manifestations of culture, although it can be plainly recognized as true only in respect of science and art. It cannot be doubted, however, that the remainder, too, correspond to some powerful need in human beings, perhaps to one which develops fully only in a minority of people. Nor may we allow ourselves to be misled by our own judgments concerning the value of any of these religious or philosophical systems or of these ideals. Whether we look upon them as the highest achievement of the human mind, or whether we deplore them as fallacies, one must acknowledge that where they exist, and especially where they are in the ascendant, they testify to a high level of civilization. We now have to consider the last, and certainly by no means the least important, of the components of culture, namely, the ways in which social relations, the relations of one man to another, are regulated. All that has to do with him as a neighbor, a source of help, a sexual object to others, a member of a family or of a state. It is especially difficult in this matter to remain unbiased by any ideal standards, and to ascertain exactly what is specifically cultural here. Perhaps one might begin with the statement that the first attempt ever made to regulate these social relations already contained the essential element of civilization. Had no such attempt been made, these relations would be subject to the wills of individuals. That is to say, the man who was physically strongest would decide things in accordance with his own interests and desires. The situation would remain the same, even though this strong man should in his turn meet with another who was stronger than he. Human life in communities only becomes possible when a number of men unite together in strength superior to any single individual and remain united against all single individuals. The strength of this united body is then opposed as right against the strength of any individual, which is condemned as brute force. This substitution of the power of a united number for the power of a single man is the decisive step towards civilization. The essence of it lies in the circumstance that the members of the community have restricted their possibilities of gratification, whereas the individual recognized no such restrictions. The first requisite of culture, therefore, is justice. That is, the assurance that a law once made will not be broken in favor of any individual. This implies nothing about the ethical value of any such law. The further course of cultural development seems to tend towards ensuring that the law shall no longer represent the will of any small body, caste, tribe, section of the population, which may behave like a predatory individual towards other such groups, perhaps containing larger numbers. The end result would be a state of law to which all, that is, all who are capable of uniting, have contributed by making some sacrifice of their own desires, and which leaves none, again with the same exception, at the mercy of brute force. The liberty of the individual is not a benefit of culture. It was greatest before any culture, though indeed it had little value at that time, because the individual was hardly in a position to defend it. Liberty has undergone restrictions through the evolution of civilization, and justice demands that these restrictions shall apply to all. The desire for freedom that makes itself felt in a human community may be a revolt against some existing injustice, and so may prove favorable to a further development of civilization and remain compatible with it. But it may also have its origin in the primitive roots of the personality, still unfettered by civilizing influences, and so become a source of antagonism to culture. Thus, the cry for freedom is directed either against particular forms or demands of culture, or else against culture itself. It does not seem as if man could be brought, by any sort of influence, to change his nature into that of the ants. He will always, one imagines, defend his claim to individual freedom against the will of the multitude. A great part of the struggles of mankind centers round the single task of finding some expedient, i.e., satisfying solution between these individual claims and those of the civilized community. Others quan of the problems of man's fate, whether this solution can be arrived at in some particular form of culture, or whether the conflict will prove irreconcilable. What culture does to love? This task seems too big a one. One may well confess oneself diffident. Here follows what little I have been able to elicit about it. Once primitive man had made the discovery that it lay in his own hands, speaking literally, to improve his lot on earth by working. It cannot have been a matter of indifference to him whether another man worked with him or against him. The other acquired the value of a fellow worker, and it was advantageous to live with him. Even earlier, in his ape, like prehistory, man had adopted the habit of forming families. His first helpers were probably the members of his family. One may suppose that the founding of families was in some way connected with the period when the need for genital satisfaction, no longer appearing like an occasional guest who turns up suddenly and then vanishes without letting one hear anything of him for long intervals. Ud had settled down with each man like a permanent lodger. When this happened, the male acquired a motive for keeping the female, or rather, his sexual objects, near him, while the female, who wanted not to be separated from her helpless young, in their interests, too, had to stay by the stronger male. In this primitive family, one essential feature of culture is lacking. The will of the father, the head of it, was unfettered. I have endeavored in totem untaboo to show how the way led from this family life to the succeeding phase of communal existence in the form of a band of brothers. By overpowering the father, the sons had discovered that several men united can be stronger than a single man. The totemic stage of culture is founded upon the restrictions that the band were obliged to impose on one another in order to maintain the new system. These taboos were the first right or law. The life of human beings in common, therefore, had a twofold foundation, i.e., the compulsion to work, created by external necessity, and the power of love, causing the male to wish to keep his sexual object. The female, near him, and the female to keep near her that part of herself which has become detached from her, her child. Of Eros and Ananke were the parents of human culture too. The first result of culture was that a larger number of human beings could then live together in common. And since the two great powers were here operating together, one might have expected that further cultural evolution would have proceeded smoothly towards ever greater mastery over the external world, as well as towards greater extension in the numbers of men sharing the life in common. Nor is it easy to understand how this culture can be felt as anything but satisfying by those who partake of it. The love that instituted the family still retains its power. In its original form, it does not stop short of direct sexual satisfaction. And in its modified form as aim, inhibited friendliness, it influences our civilization. In both these forms, it carries on its task of binding men and women to one another. And it does this with greater intensity than can be achieved through the interest of work in common. The casual and undifferentiated way in which the word love is employed by language has its genetic justification. In general usage, the relation between a man and a woman whose genital desires have led them to found a family is called love. But the positive attitude of feeling between parents and children, between brothers and sisters in a family, is also called love. Although to us this relation merits the description of aim, inhibited love or affection. Love with an inhibited aim was indeed originally full sensual love, and in men's unconscious minds is so still. Both of them, the sensual and the aim, inhibited forms, reach out beyond the family and create new bonds with others who before were strangers. Genital love leads to the forming of new families, aim, inhibited love to friendships, which are valuable culturally because they do not entail many of the limitations of genital love. For instance, its exclusiveness. But the interrelations between love and culture lose their simplicity as development proceeds. On the one hand, love opposes the interests of culture. On the other, culture menaces love with grievous restrictions. This rift between them seems inevitable. The cause of it is not immediately recognizable. It expresses itself first in a conflict between the family and the larger community to which the individual belongs. We have seen already that one of culture's principal endeavors is to cement men and women together into larger units. But the family will not give up the individual. The closer the attachment between the members of it, the more they often tend to remain aloof from others, and the harder it is for them to enter into the wider circle of the world at large. That form of life in common, which is phylogenetically older and is in childhood its only form, resists being displaced by the type that becomes acquired later with culture. Detachment from the family has become a task that awaits every adolescent, and often society helps him through it with pubertal and initiatory rites. One gets the impression that these difficulties form an integral part of every process of mental evolution, and indeed, at bottom, of every organic development, too. The tendency of culture to set restrictions upon sexual life is no less evident than its other aim of widening its sphere of operations. Even the earliest phase of it, the totemic, brought in its train the prohibition against incestuous object choice. Perhaps the most maiming wound ever inflicted throughout the ages on the erotic life of man. Further limitations are laid on it by taboos, laws, and customs, which touch men as well as women. Various types of culture differ in the lengths to which they carry this, and the material structure of the social fabric also affects the measure of sexual freedom that remains. We have seen that culture obeys the laws of psychological economic necessity in making the restrictions, for it obtains a great part of the mental energy it needs by subtracting it from sexuality. Culture behaves towards sexuality in this respect like a tribe or a section of the population which has gained the upper hand and is exploiting the rest to its own advantage. A fear of a revolt among the oppressed then becomes a motive for even stricter regulations. A high water mark in this type of development has been reached in our Western European civilization. Psychologically, it is fully justified in beginning by censuring any manifestations of the sexual life of children, for there would be no prospect of curbing the sexual desires of adults if the ground had not been prepared for it in childhood. Nevertheless, there is no sort of justification for the lengths beyond this to which civilized society goes in actually denying the existence of these manifestations, which are not merely demonstrable, but positively glaring. Where sexually mature persons are concerned, object choice is further narrowed down to the opposite sex, and most of the extragenital forms of satisfaction are interdicted as perversions. The standard which declares itself in these prohibitions is that of a sexual life identical for all. It pays no heed to the disparities in the inborn and acquired sexual constitutions of individuals and cuts off a considerable number of them from sexual enjoyment, thus becoming a cause of grievous injustice. The effect of these restrictive measures might presumably be that all the sexual interest of those who are normal and not constitutionally handicapped could flow without further forfeiture into the channel left open to it. But the only outlet not thus censured, heterosexual genital love, is further circumscribed by the barriers of legitimacy and monogamy. Present-day civilization gives us plainly to understand that sexual relations are permitted only on the basis of a final, indissoluble bond between a man and woman. That sexuality as a source of enjoyment for its own sake is unacceptable to it, and that its intention is to tolerate it only as the hitherto irreplaceable means of multiplying the human race. This, of course, represents an extreme. Everyone knows that it has proved impossible to put it into execution, even for short periods. Only the weaklings have submitted to such comprehensive interference with their sexual freedom, and stronger natures have done so only under one compensatory condition, of which mention may be made later. Civilized society has seen itself obliged to pass over in silence many transgressions, which by its own ordinances it ought to have penalized. This does not justify anyone, however, in leaning towards the other side and assuming that, because it does not achieve all it aims at. Such an attitude on the part of society is altogether harmless. The sexual life of civilized man is seriously disabled. Whatever we may say, it sometimes makes an impression of being a function in process of becoming atrophied, just as organs like our teeth and our hair seem to be. One is probably right in supposing that the importance of sexuality as a source of pleasurable sensations, i.e., as a means of fulfilling the purpose of life, has perceptibly decreased. Sometimes one perceives that it is not only the oppression of culture, but something in the nature of the function itself that denies us full satisfaction and urges us in other directions. This may be an error. It is hard to decide. Thou shalt love thy neighbor. Psychoanalytic work has shown that these frustrations in respect of sexual life are especially unendurable to the so called neurotics among us. These persons manufacture substitute gratifications for themselves in their symptoms, which, however, are either painful in themselves or become the cause of suffering owing to the difficulties they create with the person's environment and society at large. It is easy to understand the latter fact, but the former presents us with a new problem. But culture demands other sacrifices besides that of sexual gratifications. From all this, we might well imagine that a civilized community could consist of pairs of individuals, such as this, libidinally satisfied in each other, and linked to all the others by work and common interests. If this were so, culture would not need to levy energy from sexuality. But such a desirable state of things does not exist and never has existed. In actuality, culture is not content with such limited ties as these. We see that it endeavors to bind the members of the community to one another by libidinal ties as well, that it makes use of every means and favors every avenue by which powerful identifications can be created among them, and that it exacts a heavy toll of aim, inhibited libido, in order to strengthen communities by bonds of friendship between the members. Restrictions upon sexual life are unavoidable if this object is to be attained. But we cannot see the necessity that forces culture along this path and gives rise to its antagonism to sexuality. It must be due to some disturbing influence not yet detected by us. We may find the clue in one of the so-called ideal standards of civilized society. It runs, "Thou shalt love thy neighbor as the self." It is world-renowned, undoubtedly older than Christianity, which parades it as its proudest profession, yet certainly not very old. In historical times men still knew nothing of it. we will adopt a naïve attitude towards it, as if we were meeting it for the first time. Thereupon we find ourselves unable to suppress a feeling of astonishment, as at something unnatural. Why should we do this? What good is it to us? Above all, how can we do such a thing? How could it possibly be done? My love seems to me a valuable thing that I have no right to throw away without reflection. It imposes obligations on me, which I must be prepared to make sacrifices to fulfill. If I love someone, he must be worthy of it in some way or other. So I am leaving out of account now the use he may be to me, as well as his possible significance to me as a sexual object. Neither of these two kinds of relationship between us come into question where the injunction to love my neighbor is concerned. He will be worthy of it. If he is so like me in important respects that I can love myself in him, worthy of it, if he is so much more perfect than I that I can love my ideal of myself in him, I must love him if he is the son of my friend. Since the pain my friend would feel, if anything untoward happened to him, would be my pain, I should have to share it. But if he is a stranger to me, and cannot attract me by any value he has in himself or any significance he may have already acquired in my emotional life, it will be hard for me to love him. I shall even be doing wrong if I do, for my love is valued as a privilege by all those belonging to me. It is an injustice to them if I put a stranger on a level with them. But if I am to love him, Ellis, with that kind of universal love, simply because he too is a denizen of the earth, like an insect or an earthworm or a grass, snake, then I fear that but a small modicum of love will fall to his lot, and it would be impossible for me to give him as much as, by all the laws of reason, I am entitled to retain for myself. What is the point of an injunction promulgated with such solemnity, if reason does not recommend it to us? When I look more closely, I find still further difficulties. Not merely is this stranger on the whole not worthy of love, but, to be honest, I must confess he has more claim to my hostility, even to my hatred. He does not seem to have the least trace of love for me, does not show me the slightest consideration. If it will do him any good, he has no hesitation in injuring me, never even asking himself whether the amount of advantage he gains by it bears any proportion to the amount of wrong done to me. What is more, he does not even need to get an advantage from it. If he can merely get a little pleasure out of it, he thinks nothing of jeering at me, insulting me, slandering me, showing his power over me, and the more secure he feels himself, or the more helpless I am, with so much more certainty, can I expect this behavior from him towards me. If he behaved differently, if he showed me consideration, and did not molest me, I should in any case, without the aforesaid commandment, be willing to treat him similarly. If the high sounding ordinance had run, "Love thy neighbor as the neighbor loves thee," I should not take objection to it. And there is a second commandment that seems to me even more incomprehensible and arouses still stronger opposition in me. It is, love thine enemies. When I think it over, however, I am wrong in treating it as a greater imposition. It is at bottom the same thing. Men are not gentle creatures. The bit of truth behind all this, one so eagerly denied, is that men are not gentle, friendly creatures wishing for love, who simply defend themselves if they are attacked, but that a powerful measure of desire for aggression has to be reckoned as part of their instinctual endowment. The result is that their neighbor is to them not only a possible helper or sexual object, but also a temptation to them to gratify their aggressiveness on him, to exploit his capacity for work without recompense, to use him sexually without his consent, to seize his possessions, to humiliate him, to cause him pain, to torture, and to kill him. Homo homini lupus, who has the courage to dispute it in the face of all the evidence in his own life and in history. This aggressive cruelty usually lies in wait for some provocation, or else it steps into the service of some other purpose, the aim of which might as well have been achieved by milder measures. In circumstances that favor it, when those forces in the mind, which ordinarily inhibit it, cease to operate, it also manifests itself spontaneously and reveals men as savage beasts, to whom the thought of sparing their own kind is alien. Anyone who calls to mind the atrocities of the early migrations, of the invasion by the Huns or by the So, called Mongols under Genghis Khan and Tamerlane, of the sack of Jerusalem by the pious Crusaders, even indeed the horrors of the last World War, will have to bow his head humbly before the truth of this view of man. The existence of this tendency to aggression, which we can detect in ourselves and rightly presume to be present in others, is the factor that disturbs our relations with our neighbors and makes it necessary for culture to institute its high demands. Civilized society is perpetually menaced with disintegration through this primary hostility of men towards one another. Their interests in their common work would not hold them together. The passions of instinct are stronger than reasoned interests. Culture has to call up every possible reinforcement in order to erect barriers against the aggressive instincts of men and hold their manifestations in check by reaction, formations in men's minds. Hence its system of methods by which mankind is to be driven to identifications and aim, inhibited love, relationships, hence the restrictions on sexual life, and hence, 2. Its ideal command to love one's neighbor as oneself, which is really justified by the fact that nothing is so completely at variance with original human nature as this. With all its striving, this endeavor of cultures has so far not achieved very much. Civilization expects to prevent the worst atrocities of brutal violence by taking upon itself the right to employ violence against criminals. But the law is not able to lay hands on the more discreet and subtle forms in which human aggressions are expressed. The time comes when every one of us has to abandon the illusory anticipations with which in our youth we regarded our fellow men. And when we realize how much hardship and suffering we have been caused in life through their ill will, it would be unfair, however, to reproach culture with trying to eliminate all disputes and competition from human concerns. These things are undoubtedly indispensable, but opposition is not necessarily enmity. Only it may be misused to make an opening for it. The communists believe they have found a way of delivering us from this evil. Man is wholeheartedly good and friendly to his neighbor, they say, but the system of private property has corrupted his nature. The possession of private property gives power to the individual, and thence the temptation arises to treat his neighbor. The man who is excluded from the possession of property is obliged to rebel in hostility against the oppressor. If private property were abolished, all valuables held in common, and all allowed to share in the enjoyment of them, ill will and enmity would disappear from among men. Since all needs would be satisfied, none would have any reason to regard another as an enemy. All would willingly undertake the work which is necessary. I have no concern with any economic criticisms of the communistic system. I cannot inquire into whether the abolition of private property is advantageous and expedient. But I am able to recognize that psychologically it is founded on an untenable illusion. By abolishing private property, one deprives the human love of aggression of one of its instruments, a strong one undoubtedly, but assuredly not the strongest. It in no way alters the individual differences in power and influence which are turned by aggressiveness to its own use. Nor does it change the nature of the instinct in any way. This instinct did not arise as the result of property. It reigned almost supreme in primitive times, when possessions were still extremely scanty. It shows itself already in the nursery, when possessions have hardly grown out of their original anal shape. It is at the bottom of all the relations of affection and love between human beings, possibly with the single exception of that of a mother to her male child. Suppose that personal rights to material goods are done away with. There still remain prerogatives in sexual relationships, which must arouse the strongest rancor and most violent enmity among men and women who are otherwise equal. Let us suppose this were also to be removed by instituting complete liberty in sexual life, so that the family, the germ cell of culture, ceased to exist. One could not, it is true, foresee the new paths on which cultural development might then proceed. But one thing one would be bound to expect, and that is that the ineffaceable feature of human nature would follow wherever it led. If civilization requires such sacrifices, not only of sexuality, but also of the aggressive tendencies in mankind, we can better understand why it should be so hard for men to feel happy in it. In actual fact, primitive man was better off in this respect, for he knew nothing of any restrictions on his instincts. As a set off against this, his prospects of enjoying his happiness for any length of time were very slight. Civilized man has exchanged some part of his chances of happiness for a measure of security. We will not forget, however, that in the primal family, only the head of it enjoyed this instinctual freedom. The other members lived in slavish thraldom. The antithesis between a minority enjoying cultural advantages and a majority who are robbed of them was therefore most extreme in that primeval period of culture. With regard to the primitive human types living at the present time, careful investigation has revealed that their instinctual life is by no means to be envied on account of its freedom. It is subject to restrictions of a different kind, but perhaps even more rigorous than is that of modern civilized man. In rightly finding fault, as we thus do, with our present state of civilization for so inadequately providing us with what we require to make us happy in life, and for the amount of suffering of a probably avoidable nature it lays us open to, in doing our utmost to lay bare the roots of its deficiencies by our unsparing criticisms, we are undoubtedly exercising our just rights and not showing ourselves enemies of culture. We may expect that in the course of time changes will be carried out in our civilization so that it becomes more satisfying to our needs and no longer open to the reproaches we have made against it. But perhaps we shall also accustom ourselves to the idea that there are certain difficulties inherent in the very nature of culture which will not yield to any efforts at reform. Over and above the obligations of putting restrictions upon our instincts, which we see to be inevitable, we are imminently threatened with the dangers of a state one may call la miserie psychologique of groups. This danger is most menacing where the social forces of cohesion consist predominantly of identifications of the individuals in the group with one another, whilst leading personalities fail to acquire the significance that should fall to them in the process of group formation. The state of civilization in America at the present day offers a good opportunity for studying this injurious effect of civilization which we have reason to dread. But I will resist the temptation to enter upon a criticism of American culture. I have no desire to give the impression that I would employ American methods myself. Eros and the death instinct. Never, before in any of my previous writings, have I had the feeling so strongly as I have now that what I am describing is common knowledge, that I am requisitioning paper and ink, and in due course the labor of compositors and printers, in order to expound things that in themselves are obvious. For this reason, if it should appear that the recognition of a special independent instinct of aggression would entail a modification of the psycho-analytical theory of instincts, I should be glad enough to seize upon the idea. We shall see that this is not so that it is merely a matter of coming to closer quarters with a conclusion to which we long ago committed ourselves, and following it out to its logical consequences. The whole of analytic theory has evolved gradually enough, but the theory of instincts has groped its way forward under greater difficulties than any other part of it. And yet a theory of instincts was so indispensable for the rest that something had to be adopted in place of it. In my utter perplexity at the beginning, I took as my starting point the poet, philosopher Schiller's aphorism that hunger and love make the world go round. Hunger would serve to represent those instincts which aim at preservation of the individual. Love seeks for objects. Its chief function, which is favored in every way by nature, is preservation of the species. Thus first arose the contrast between ego instincts and object instincts. For the energy of the latter instincts, and exclusively for them, I introduced the term libido. An antithesis was thus formed between the ego instincts and the libidinal instincts, directed towards objects, i.e. love, in its widest sense. One of these object instincts, the sadistic, certainly stood out from the rest in that its aim was so very unloving. Moreover, it clearly allied itself in many of its aspects with the ego instincts, and its close kinship with instincts of mastery, without any libidinal purpose, could not be concealed. But these ambiguities could be overcome in spite of them. Sadism plainly belonged to sexual life. The game of cruelty could take the place of the game of love. Neurosis appeared as the outcome of a struggle between the interests of self-preservation and the claims of libido, a struggle in which the ego was victorious, but at the price of great suffering and renunciations. The assumption of the existence of a death instinct or a destruction instinct has roused opposition, even in analytical circles. I know that there is a great tendency to ascribe all that is dangerous and hostile in love rather to a fundamental bipolarity in its own nature. The conceptions I have summarized here, I first put forward only tentatively. But in the course of time, they have won such a hold over me that I can no longer think in any other way. To my mind, they are theoretically far more fruitful than any others it is possible to employ. They provide us with that simplification, without either ignoring or doing violence to the facts, which is what we strive after in scientific work. I know that we have always had before our eyes manifestations of the destruction, instinct fused with erotism, directed outwards and inwards in sadism and masochism. But I can no longer understand how we could have overlooked the universality of non-erotic aggression and destruction, and could have omitted to give it its due significance in our interpretation of life. It is true that the destructive trend that is directed inwards, when it is not erotically tinged, usually eludes our perceptions. I can remember my own defensive attitude when the idea of an instinct of destruction first made its appearance in psychoanalytical literature, and how long it took until I became accessible to it. That others should have shown the same resistance, and still show it, surprises me less. Those who love fairy tales do not like it when people speak of the innate tendencies in mankind towards aggression, destruction, and, in addition, cruelty. For God has made them in His own image, with His own perfections. No one wants to be reminded how hard it is to reconcile the undeniable existence, in spite of all the protestations of Christian science, of evil with His omnipotence and supreme goodness. The devil is, in fact, the best way out in acquittal of God. He can be used to play the same economic role of outlet as Jews in the world of Aryan ideals. But even so, one can just as well hold God responsible for the existence of the devil as for the evil he personifies. In view of these difficulties, it is expedient for every man to make humble obeisance on suitable occasions, in honor of the high-minded nature of men. It will assist him to become universally beloved, and much shall be forgiven unto him on account of it. In all that follows, I take up the standpoint that the tendency to aggression is an innate, independent, instinctual disposition in man. And I come back now to the statement that it constitutes the most powerful obstacle to culture. At one point in the course of this discussion, the idea took possession of us that culture was a peculiar process passing over human life, and we are still under the influence of this idea. We may add to this that the process proves to be in the service of Eros, which aims at binding together single human individuals, then families, then tribes, races, nations, into one great unity, that of humanity. Why this has to be done, we do not know. It is simply the work of Eros. These masses of men must be bound to one another libidinally, necessity alone. The advantages of common work would not hold them together. The natural instinct of aggressiveness in man, the hostility of each one against all, and of all against each one, opposes this program of civilization. This instinct of aggression is the derivative and main representative of the death instinct we have found alongside of Eros, sharing his rule over the earth. And now, it seems to me, the meaning of the evolution of culture is no longer a riddle to us. It must present to us the struggle between Eros and death, between the instincts of life and the instincts of destruction, as it works itself out in the human species. This struggle is what all life essentially consists of, and so the evolution of civilization may be simply described as the struggle of the human species for existence. And it is this battle of the titans that our nurses and governesses try to compose with their lullaby, Song of Heaven! The sense of guilt. Another question concerns us more closely now. What means does civilization make use of to hold in check the aggressiveness that opposes it, to make it harmless, perhaps to get rid of it? Some of these measures we have already come to know, though not yet the one that is apparently the most important. We can study it in the evolution of the individual. What happens in him to render his craving for aggression innocuous? Something very curious that we should never have guessed, and that yet seems simple enough. The aggressiveness is introjected, internalized, in fact. It is sent back where it came from, i.e., directed against the ego. It is there taken over by a part of the ego that distinguishes itself from the rest as a super-ego, and now, in the form of conscience, exercises the same propensity to harsh aggressiveness against the ego that the ego would have liked to enjoy against others. The tension between the strict super-ego and the subordinate ego we call the sense of guilt. It manifests itself as the need for punishment. Civilization, therefore, obtains the mastery over the dangerous love of aggression in individuals by enfeebling and disarming it, and setting up an institution within their minds to keep watch over it, like a garrison in a conquered city. As to the origin of the sense of guilt, analysts have different views from those of the psychologists, nor is it easy for analysts to explain it either. First of all, when one asks how a sense of guilt arises in anyone, one is told something one cannot dispute. People feel guilty. Pious people call it sinful when they have done something they know to be bad. But then one sees how little this answer tells one. Perhaps after some hesitation one will add that a person who has not actually committed a bad act, but has merely become aware of the intention to do so, can also hold himself guilty, and then one will ask why in this case the intention is counted as equivalent to the deed. In both cases, however, one is presupposing that wickedness has already been recognized as reprehensible, as something that ought not to be put into execution. How is this judgment arrived at? One may reject the suggestion of an original, as one might say, natural capacity for discriminating between good and evil. Evil is often not at all that which would injure or endanger the ego. On the contrary, it can also be something that it desires, that would give it pleasure. An extraneous influence is evidently at work. It is this that decides what is to be called good and bad. Since their own feelings would not have led men along the same path, they must have had a motive for obeying this extraneous influence. It is easy to discover this motive in man's helplessness and dependence upon others. It can best be designated the dread of losing love. If he loses the love of others on whom he is dependent, he will forfeit also their protection against many dangers. And above all, he runs the risk that this stronger person will show his superiority in the form of punishing him. What is bad is, therefore, to begin with, whatever causes one to be threatened with a loss of love. Because of the dread of this loss, one must desist from it. That is why it makes little difference whether one has already committed the bad deed or only intends to do so. In either case, the danger begins only when the authority has found it out, and the latter would behave in the same way in both cases. We call this state of mind a bad conscience. But actually it does not deserve this name. For at this stage the sense of guilt is obviously only the dread of losing love, social anxiety. In a little child, it can never be anything else. But in many adults, too, it has only changed insofar as the larger human community takes the place of the father or of both parents. Consequently, such people habitually permit themselves to do any bad deed that procures them something they want, if only they are sure that no authority will discover it or make them suffer for it. Their anxiety relates only to the possibility of detection. Present-day society has to take into account the prevalence of this state of mind. A great change takes place as soon as the authority has been internalized by the development of a super-ego. The manifestations of conscience are then raised to a new level. To be accurate, one should not call them conscience and sense of guilt before this. At this point, the dread of discovery ceases to operate, and also once for all any difference between doing evil and wishing to do it, since nothing is hidden from the super-ego, not even thoughts. The real seriousness of the situation has vanished, it is true. For the new authority, the super-ego, has no motive, as far as we know, for ill, treating the ego with which it is itself closely bound up. But the influence of the genetic derivation of these things, which causes what has been outlived and surmounted to be lived, manifests itself so that on the whole things remain as they were at the beginning. The super-ego torments the sinful ego with the same feelings of dread and watches for opportunities whereby the outer world can be made to punish it. The Fateful Question. The analogy between the process of cultural evolution and the path of individual development may be carried further in an important respect. It can be maintained that the community, too, develops a super-ego under whose influence cultural evolution proceeds. It would be an enticing task for an authority on human systems of culture to work out this analogy in specific cases. I will confine myself to pointing out certain striking details. The super-ego of any given epoch of civilization originates in the same way as that of an individual. It is based on the impression left behind them by great leading personalities, men of outstanding force of mind, or men in whom some one human tendency has developed in unusual strength and purity, often for that reason very disproportionately. In many instances, the analogy goes still further, in that during their lives, often enough, even if not always, such persons are ridiculed by others, ill-used or even cruelly done to death, just as happened with the primal father, who also rose again to become a deity long after his death by violence. The most striking example of this double fate is the figure of Jesus Christ, if indeed it does not itself belong to the realm of mythology, which called it into being out of a dim memory of that primordial event. Another point of agreement is that the cultural superego, just like that of an individual, sets up high ideals and standards, and that failure to fulfill them is punished by both with anxiety of conscience. In this particular, indeed, we come across the remarkable circumstance that the mental processes concerned here are actually more familiar to us and more accessible to consciousness when they proceed from the group than they can be in the individual. In the latter, when tension arises, the aggressions of the super, ego voicing its noisy reproaches, are all that is perceived, while its injunctions themselves often remain unconscious in the background. If we bring them to the knowledge of consciousness, we find that they coincide with the demands of the prevailing cultural super ego. At this point, the two processes, that of the evolution of the group and the development of the individual, are always firmly mortized together, so to speak. Consequently, many of the effects and properties of the super ego can be more easily detected through its operations in the group than in the individual. The cultural super ego has elaborated its ideals and erected its standards. Those of its demands which deal with the relations of human beings to one another are comprised under the name of ethics. The greatest value has at all times been set upon systems of ethics, as if men had expected them, in particular, to achieve something especially important. And ethics does in fact deal predominantly with the point, which is easily seen to be the sorest of all in any scheme of civilization. Ethics must be regarded, therefore, as a therapeutic effort, as an endeavor to achieve something through the standards imposed by the super ego, which had not been attained by the work of civilization in other ways. We already know, it is what we have been discussing, that the question is how to dislodge the greatest obstacle to civilization, the constitutional tendency in men to aggressions against one another, and for that very reason the commandment to love one's neighbor as oneself, probably the most recent of the cultural super ego's demands, is especially interesting to us. In our investigations and our therapy of the neuroses, we cannot avoid finding fault with the super ego of the individual on two counts. In commanding and prohibiting with such severity, it troubles too little about the happiness of the ego, and it fails to take into account sufficiently the difficulties in the way of obeying it, of the strength of instinctual cravings in the ID, and the hardships of external environment. Consequently, in our therapy, we often find ourselves obliged to do battle with the superego and work to moderate its demands. Exactly the same objections can be made against the ethical standards of the cultural superego. It, too, does not trouble enough about the mental constitution of human beings. It enjoins a command and never asks whether or not it is possible for them to obey it. It presumes, on the contrary, that a man's ego is psychologically capable of anything that is required of it, that his ego has unlimited power over his id. This is an error, even in so-called normal people the power of controlling the id cannot be increased beyond certain limits. If one asks more of them, one produces revolt or neurosis in individuals or makes them unhappy. The command to love our neighbors as ourselves is the strongest defense there is against human aggressiveness, and it is a superlative example of the unpsychological attitude of the cultural super-ego. The command is impossible to fulfill. Such an enormous inflation of love can only lower its value and not remedy the evil. Civilization pays no heed to all this. It merely prates that the harder it is to obey, the more laudable the obedience. The fact remains that anyone who follows such preaching in the present state of civilization only puts himself at a disadvantage beside all those who set it at naught. What an overwhelming obstacle to civilization aggression must be if the defense against it can cause as much misery as aggression itself. Natural ethics, as it is called, has nothing to offer here beyond the narcissistic satisfaction of thinking oneself better than others. The variety of ethics that links itself with religion brings in at this point its promises of a better future life. I should imagine that as long as virtue is not rewarded in this life, ethics will preach in vain. I too think it unquestionable that an actual change in men's attitude to property would be of more help in this direction than any ethical commands. But among the socialists, this proposal is obscured by new idealistic expectations, disregarding human nature, which detract from its value in actual practice. The fateful question of the human species seems to me to be whether, and to what extent, the cultural process developed in it will succeed in mastering the derangements of communal life caused by the human instinct of aggression and self-destruction. In this connection, perhaps the phase through which we are at this moment passing deserves special interest. Men have brought their powers of subduing the forces of nature to such a pitch that by using them, they could now very easily exterminate one another to the last man. They know this, hence arises a great part of their current unrest, their dejection, their mood of apprehension. And now it may be expected that the other of the two heavenly forces, eternal Eros, will put forth his strength so as to maintain himself alongside of his equally immortal adversary.
That was his argument in his own order with the detours taken out. He ends on a question and leaves it open. He wrote that last page in 1930 in Vienna. What happened next in that city is the part he did not live to write. That was the whole book. Subscribe and you will not miss the next audiobook.